Why did we have to do that, Mr. President? Sa dami na ng... hindi pa tayo makakame up ng total amount of the fiscal space which we have freed up sa programmed appropriations because hindi natin alam yung how much of the 373 billion of new items under unprogrammed appropriations came from program. Hindi pa natin alam. But we will add to that the MPBF, we add to that the PGF na mga freed amounts plus the 74 of the Philhealth. Kinailangan pa ba natin na i-zero talaga si Philhealth to free up 74 billion pesos, Mr. President?
Ito na nga, nagkainita na. Senator Koko Pimentel, binira si Senator Grace po sa usapin ng Philhealth. Pero bago ang lahat, maaari kayong mag-subscribe para maging updated sa mga issue at bagong mga balita. Galit na galit nga ngayon si Senator Koko Pimentel matapos inabuso ang budget ng Philhealth. Ayon pa kay Senator Grace po, kailangan bigyang pansin umano ang iba pang programa ng gobyerno. Sagot naman ni Pimentel, health is wealth. Bakit kailangan i-zero ang budget? Narito ang buong detalye.
Our duty, being the minority, to ask some questions, especially about the BICAM report on the national budget, especially after having noticed some significant swings. When we say swing, let's say net changes in some of the budgetary items, Mr. President, reported to us. No? Kasi we are, right before me is a summary of the conference committee report, Mr. President. So with the permission of our chairperson, our chairwoman, if this representation can proceed with these questions, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I'll gladly take this opportunity.
Mr. President, I'll start with one of the issues that I raised in last year's budget process, or meaning to say, covering the 2024 budget, which is the issue on the level of the unprogrammed appropriations, Mr. President. If I can start with that, Mr. President, if our chairwoman can inform us, all of us, what is now the level of the unprogrammed appropriations under our bicameral conference committee report?
The unprogrammed appropriations is 531,665
million, yes. So that's now the ending of our BICAM report. But then, our NEP, okay, if our chairwoman can find out what was the NEP level of the unprogrammed appropriations, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the NEP level is 158.665 billion.
Yes, Mr. President. So, paki-minus nga. 531.
So it's an increase
yes,
of 373.
It's here. Yes, an increase of 373 billion pesos. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this practice of increasing the unprogrammed appropriations in the final version of the national budget over and above the level of the unprogrammed appropriations recommended by the President in the President's budget, or called the NEP, is one of the issues I have raised before the Supreme Court. And we are repeating the said practice in our plan for the 2025 budget. Mas maliit nga kasi for 2024 halos if I'm not mistaken 400 billion yung in-increase ngayon, pero it's still ito 373 billion pesos. So was increase. We're increasing it. So was this issue ever ever touched in the discussion of our chairwoman with the chair of the House panel, Mr. President?
Mr. President, this was actually discussed with our technical working group. What we have decided is that we have limited resources, but there are so many programs that we would like to fund. And unfortunately, we don't have the immediate amount on hand. So there's still certain projects that will be categorized in the unfunded, unprogrammed appropriations. Ideally, there should be none, and I would concede that. That's why from last year, from this year, 2024, which was 737 billion, now we are at 531 billion. There are obviously a long ways to go when it comes to having more fiscal discipline. But this is the reality, and I'm transparent about this, that we really have unprogrammed appropriations. Last year, if I may mention, what was released for this year is
438 billion
as of November, from the 737 billion, Mr. President, out of the 731 billion, 438 billion of the unprogrammed funds for 2024 was released. So certain priority projects also that were put in the unprogrammed have been funded already.
So meaning to say, since we have data already for year 2024, for year 2024, the administration has released under the unprogrammed appropriations an amount larger than the original figure in the NEP under unprogrammed appropriations for the year 2024. Tama
No,
po?
Mr. President, for 2024, it's 731 billion.
Correct. Yan po yung sa GAA na natin.
For
But
the NEP.
For the NEP, that must have been around 300 billion. Tama po ba?
Yes, Mr. President,
Yes,
281 billion.
281 billion. But now, from actual figures, they have released around 400 billion of the 700 billion in the unprogrammed.
Yes,
Tama.
Mr.
Sige
President.
po. I'm just establishing po that fact, Mr. President. But then, Mr. President, unfortunately, this representation has to be consistent with his stand, Mr. President, and his beliefs, Mr. President. So, that means that we have another issue, Mr. President, which can possibly reach the Supreme Court. Because the Constitution talks about appropriations, that the Congress may not increase the appropriations as recommended by the President. So, very simple lang naman yung interpretation ko po. When the word appropriations is used, it does not distinguish between programmed and unprogrammed appropriations.
Well, Mr. President, the unprogrammed is really not part of the total of the BICAM report or the budget proposed. Okay, so it's obviously, that's why it's called unprogrammed, it's unfunded. Now, if you mention about the President has the power to appropriate for the unprogrammed funds based on certain criterias. First of all, it has to come from a source. For example, extra collections from the government, from GOCCs, dividends, extra collections from the BIR, etc., or even loan proceeds, which, as I understand now, even our Secretary of Finance is not really very keen on adding more additional loans because we have to keep our debt to GDP ratio at around 60 to 61%. So this will really come from extra funding that the government is able to collect.
And for the year 2024, there was an extra or an additional mechanism inserted. in funding and unprogrammed appropriations, yun yung sweeping of the so-called idle funds which affected Philhealth. Sinasabi ko lang yan so that I will also not forget to raise Philhealth later on. Pero, okay. But Mr. President, yung 400 billion of the items under unprogrammed appropriations na na-release na at na-fund na for so far for the year 2024, what was the legal basis for funding them? Isn't it dagaa, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President,
Correct,
that was
correct.
actually one of the provisions in the GAA that funding from other sources, government revenue, in excess, can fund unprogrammed appropriations.
Correct. So, meaning to say, kahit si unprogrammed is not unprogrammed talaga siya, so hindi siya talaga kasama sa total ni programmed appropriations. But the legal basis, kasi ang general rule sa Constitution natin, no public funds shall be spent except pursuant to an appropriations provided by law. So when those 400 billion items under unprogrammed appropriations were funded, what was the law made as the basis for funding them? Hindi po ba GAA din of 2024?
Yes, Mr.
Correct.
President.
Okay, tama po. Meaning to say, pag sinabing appropriations, kasama si programmed at si unprogrammed. So, Mr. President, with this information, I have no choice but to once again raise this before the Supreme Court, maybe in a new case or siguro, supplemental ba? Or supplemental petition before the Supreme Court, Mr. President.
But, Mr. President, just for clarification, anyway, you're the legal expert here. There's really, all GOCCs remit also to the government, excess funds. And then the GAA, the GAA itself is a law. Now, if these are unprogrammed, I understand that the President also has the power to allocate certain funding options for certain programs. Now, when our minority leader raised this issue with the Supreme Court, I know it was very specific for the Philhealth funds, which was actually savings that is not really an income-generating matter that has to be automatically appropriated to the government, unlike other agencies that any dividends should be transferred to the government. I know that Philhealth isn't. So with the clarity given by the Supreme Court, we have that guidance already in mind. That's why we did not specifically put a provision exactly like what we had in 2024.
So our chairwoman is informing us that the fourth trigger or fourth mechanism found in the 2024 GAA as about sweeping idle funds is no longer found in our 2025.
Yes, Mr. President.
bill. But then, Mr. President, yung petition ko po sa Supreme Court is different. Actually, separate yun. I have actually 4 cases before the Supreme Court, Mr. President. One is questioning the level of the unprogrammed appropriations. Number 2 is the Philhealth, the order to sweep 89.9 billion pesos of Philhealth funds. The third would be the Maharlika Corporation. And the fourth would be our intra-party dispute with the party of Senator Robin Padilla, Mr. President. So these are the 4 cases pending before the Supreme Court, Mr. President. So anyway, at any rate, okay, Mr. President, does this mean, since we increased the unprogrammed appropriations level by 373 billion pesos, does this mean that we transferred from programmed appropriations under the President's budget 373 billion pesos worth of line items, and we transferred this to the unprogrammed appropriations part? Is that a correct statement?
Well, Mr. President, yes, partly
Yes,
some
correct.
of them were transferred. But Remember, this is also based on a consultation of what the priorities are. Of course, we always have a wish list of projects and also initiatives, but in the end, we also look at the disbursement rate, the utilization rate.
Meaning to say, yung 373 billion pesos na increase sa unprogrammed appropriations, lahat ng idea doon, lahat ng items na yon, yung PAPs ang tawag yan lahat ng programs, activities, and projects na yon, were originally found in the President's budget but under programmed appropriations. Is that a correct statement?
Mr. President, some of them
Some?
were not in the original NEP or the President's proposals. Some of them were actually amendments done by institutional amendments done by either houses.
Okay, by Congress. So, does the chairwoman have the, anong tawag mo doon? Breakdown, which, okay, how much of the 373 billion pesos now found in unprogrammed originally came from programmed appropriations under the NEP?
Mr. President, may we be able to submit that to Your Honor with regards to the specific, because it's quite lengthy to go back to all of them.
Just the total, not the total lang, because bakit ko to tinatanong? Because that means that is now the fiscal space made available under programmed appropriations. That's my point, Mr. President. Kaya ang next tanong, of this fiscal space, paano napuno yun? Saan din galing yung mga new PAPs na pinampuno doon sa amount na yun? Doon patungo yung pagtatanong ko po, Mr. President.
As an example, Mr. President, the foreign assisted projects in the NEP of 2025 is 215,649. Now, what the BICAM approved is 66,279. So basically, 149,370 is now in the unprogrammed.
Yes, binaba. Okay, so let's say 149. But definitely more than that amount siguro, no? You're just using that as an example.
Yes.
Example.
There are also others.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the level for programmed appropriations did not change. Tama po ba yun? From the NEP level, programmed appropriations is still now, the BICAM report level for programmed appropriations is the same as the NEP level. Tama?
Yes, Mr.
Correct.
President.
Meaning to say, kung nagbaba tayo ng 149 billion, inalis natin sa President's programmed appropriations, binaba natin, pero the level is now the same. Therefore, in the budgeting process by Congress came up with at least 149 billion new items which they funded under programmed appropriations. Tama po yun?
Yes, Mr. President.
Correct. That's why we need to know the level, Mr. President. But anyway, the chairwoman has promised to give us in writing na lang, no? The level. So that is what happened. And then, Mr. President, if I can ask about the miscellaneous personnel benefits fund, sa NEP, sa President's budget, 163 billion pesos ang level niyan. Sa BICAM report natin, 109 billion pesos. Meaning to say, nag-free up din tayo ng 54 billion pesos. Kasi hindi rin nagbago yung bottom line. Bottom line, the same. So, is it correct to say that the 54 billion pesos na inalis natin sa MPBF ay nalagyan din ng new items by Congress? Tama po ba yun?
Yes, Mr. President. Also for the miscellaneous and personal benefits, there are a lot of reasons. There are reasons also for that. For example, although there are items in the proposed NEP the reality is also certain job positions are not filled. That's why we also looked at the utilization rate, disbursement rate as in the past.
Yes, and we were able to free up, let us say, MPBF line lang ito,
54
billion. Kaya
Yes,
nga, and
Mr.
then,
President.
since hindi nagbago si bottom line, ibig sabihin nun, nalagay sa ibang mga budget items yon, PAPs, na hindi na nanggaling sa Presidente, nanggaling na po sa Kongreso. Tama po?
Yes,
Tama
Mr.
po, okay. And then, pagdating sa pension and gratuity fund, sa President's budget, 232 billion ang level nito. Ang ending sa ating BICAM report, 144 billion. So, ano to, mga 88 billion pesos din po yung na-free up natin. Tama po? So, ang gusto sabihin, ang dami na natin na-free up. So,
Mr. President, it's true that compared to the NEP, there may have been a decrease, but bearing in mind also that compared to 2024, there's been an increase. And we know that for a fact that the increase can cover the current needs for personal benefits and pensions.
yes, Mr. President. Pero yun lang, I'm just looking up, I'm just pointing out the fiscal space that Congress has freed up under programmed appropriations. Yun po, that's what I'm pointing out. And bago malimutan, we also freed up 74 billion pesos, 74.4 billion pesos sa Philhealth subsidy. Tama po yun, which is under programmed appropriations. Tama po?
Yes, Mr. President.
Why did we have to do that, Mr. President? Sa dami na ng... hindi pa tayo makakame up ng total amount of the fiscal space which we have freed up sa programmed appropriations because hindi natin alam yung how much of the 373 billion of new items under unprogrammed appropriations came from program. Hindi pa natin alam eh. But we will add to that the MPBF, we add to that the PGF na mga freed amounts, plus the 74 of the Philhealth. Kinailangan pa ba natin na i-zero talaga si Philhealth to free up 74 billion pesos, Mr. President?
I know, Mr. President, that's also the question of many. And I've thought about this long and hard. And there's no denying that Philhealth has a savings amount of 600 billion, Mr. President. And that's also the reason why initially the administration thought of it as a way also to augment certain short fundings that we had, for example, for health workers, etc. Hindi natin maintindihan ba't hindi nila ginagamit yung pera na nandun na meron sila na nakaimbak sa isang, ewan ko kung anong klaseng account yan, savings account, na ang kinikita ay mas mababa pa kesa sa inflation. Mr. President, hindi pwedeng sisihin na nagkulang tayo sa pagbibigay sa kanila. Kasi nga ang daming ang pera na nandyan. Hindi nila pinamimigay ang pera dun sa mga nangangailangan at tinuturuan din natin sila ng leksyon. Kung bigay ka ng bigay, nandun lang yung pera, hindi naman nagagamit. Paano naman yung mga ibang programa rin ng gobyerno na nangangailangan din ng funding? Yun nga yung sinasabi ko, pag meron kang, syempre, di ba, sinasabi natin, 5 yung anak mo, lahat yan kailangan pantay-pantay na mabigyan mo. Totoo yun. Pero sa lahat sa kanila, tinitignan mo rin kung sino may pangangailangan at sino naman ang may kakayanan na itayo rin ang kanyang sarili. Yun din ang sinasabi natin, it's a leadership problem also in Philhealth and it's a disbursement problem. Gaya nga ng sinabi ni Senator Cynthia, ang problema din sa Philhealth, hindi rin natin alam kung ano ba talaga yung mga benepisyo natin. Wala tayong card na nagsasabi hanggang dito o ganyan ang maibibigay sa'yo, ang tagal-tagal ng approval minsan, hindi alam ng ating mga kababayan kung paano sila comply dun sa mga requirements. So ito yung mga nagiging issue. Hindi sila kulang sa pera. At alam ko yung iba talagang pinagdidiinan nito. Pero 600 billion ang meron sila. Samantalang, ang dami natin din pangangailangan pagdating sa edukasyon, pagdating sa infrastruktura. Alam mo, maganda talagang magbigay ng social protection, wealth transfer. Importante yan. Pero kailangan din natin ng wealth generating initiatives kasi hindi natin mapopondohan ang mga ibang bagay na magbibigay ng suporta sa ating mga kababayan kung ang gobyerno ay walang programa na magpapalago ng ating ekonomiya.
I'm reminded of the saying that health is wealth. But I don't think, Mr. President, that we can use funds meant for health so that we will justify that we will generate wealth for the nation.
Mr. President,
so,
the budget of the DOH has increased from last year.
DOH.
So it may not have been an item, for example, in particular for Philhealth. Pero, meron naman pong increase na nangyari dito sa DOH from 241,602 in 2024, yung BICAM natin nasa 247,923. So we are, of course, health is wealth. That's very important. But also, health, the financial situation of our country, the economy, and wealth-generating initiatives are important so that we can support social protection initiatives such as the health sector.
Sige, mag-digress po tayo muna sa health sector. Pero napansin ko po na ang ating final amount sa Department of Health is 247.9 billion pesos sa BICAM report, mas mababa by 25.7 billion pesos from the GAB, 273.7 billion pesos. So, binawasan pa rin natin ang DOH. And then, ang ating pampalubag-loob lang ay yung level, nung binawasan na, yung ending amount is still higher than the 2024 GAE amount?
Yes, Mr. President.
But why did we reduce it, Mr. President, by 25.7 billion pesos, which is a very significant amount also, Mr. President?